Every time you look at your pay stub, you see a significant portion of your earnings vanishing before the money ever reaches your bank account. We accept this automatic deduction as a natural law of modern life, assuming the government has always taken its share directly from the source. But this seamless system of mass extraction was meticulously engineered by Henry Morgenthau Jr., a gentleman farmer turned Treasury secretary who quietly transformed every working citizen into an involuntary lender to the state. How did a man with no formal economic training fundamentally alter the relationship between the American worker and the federal government? The answer lies not in economic theory, but in a desperate scramble to fund a global conflict. We must look back to a time when paying taxes was an exclusive club and see how Morgenthau threw the doors wide open. Born in 1891 into a wealthy New York family, Morgenthau seemed an unlikely candidate to restructure the nation's financial architecture. His father was a successful real estate investor and diplomat who set a formidable standard for public service. Yet young Henry struggled academically, dropping out of Cornell University not once, but twice. Instead of pursuing high finance or law, Morgenthau found his true passion in the dirt of agriculture. He purchased a farm in Dutchess County, New York, focusing his energy on growing apples and raising dairy cows. This seemingly mundane choice placed him geographically and socially adjacent to another wealthy patrician named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The two men bonded over their shared interest in conservation, rural economies, and quiet country life. When Roosevelt began his political ascent, Morgenthau proved to be a fiercely dedicated and reliable ally. Roosevelt trusted his neighbor deeply, valuing his unwavering personal loyalty over any technical economic expertise. As Roosevelt became governor of New York in 1928, he appointed Morgenthau to chair the State Agricultural Advisory Commission. When the Great Depression struck and Roosevelt captured the presidency in 1932, he brought his trusted confidant to Washington. Initially tasked with managing agricultural credit, Morgenthau's administrative portfolio rapidly expanded as the economic crisis deepened. In 1934, following the sudden illness of the sitting Treasury Secretary, Roosevelt handed the reins of the nation's finances to Morgenthau. Wall Street elites were absolutely stunned by the appointment of an apple farmer to the highest financial office in the land. But Roosevelt needed a loyal executor for his unprecedented New Deal programs, not a conventional banker who might resist radical economic experiments. When Morgenthau took over the Treasury Department, the American tax landscape looked completely alien compared to today. In the early 1930s, the federal income tax was essentially a wealth tax, legally applying to only a tiny fraction of the richest citizens. The vast majority of working-class Americans kept their entire paycheck, funding the government only indirectly through tariffs and hidden consumption taxes. The Internal Revenue Bureau was a relatively small agency, accustomed to analyzing complex ledgers of tycoons rather than processing millions of small returns. Tax day was a minor event for the general public, completely detached from the daily rhythm of hourly wages and weekly paychecks. Morgenthau was about to shatter this isolation, driven by a looming crisis that would require more capital than the rich alone could ever provide. By 1939, the clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and the American military was dangerously underfunded. Morgenthau realized the New Deal deficit spending had already pushed the national debt to uncomfortable levels. He knew that if the United States entered the conflict, the traditional financial mechanisms would instantly collapse. The existing tax code, designed during times of peace, relied almost entirely on corporate taxes and the extreme wealth of a few thousand millionaires. But a modern, mechanized war required a staggering, continuous flow of cash that the elite simply could not provide alone. Morgenthau recognized that the burden of funding the arsenal of democracy would have to shift to the middle and working classes. The turning point arrived with the Revenue Act of 1942, a massive piece of legislation that fundamentally reshaped the American economy. This law lowered exemption levels drastically, pulling tens of millions of ordinary workers into the federal tax net for the very first time. Practically overnight, the income tax transformed from an exclusive class tax into a universal mass tax. But declaring that millions of citizens now owed taxes was entirely different from actually collecting the money. The Treasury Department faced an administrative nightmare as working-class families had no savings set aside to pay a massive lump sum the following March. If the government waited until the end of the year to collect, mass defaults and widespread political rebellion were practically guaranteed. To solve this, Morgenthau embraced a radical idea championed by Beardsley Ruml, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Ruml proposed a pay-as-you-go system, suggesting that the government should take its cut before the worker ever saw the money. Morgenthau saw the strategic genius in this psychological sleight of hand, realizing that money never held is money rarely missed. The implementation of this new system required a complete overhaul of corporate payroll departments across the nation. The newly mandated Form W-4 forced every employee to officially declare their dependence on a government-issued card. This small piece of paper effectively drafted private employers into serving as unpaid collection agents for the federal government. Once the workers' exemptions were officially filed, the payroll clerk consulted a massive Treasury Department withholding table to determine the exact weekly deduction. The clerk's heavy ledger recorded the gross wage, but the physical pay envelope handed to the worker contained only the net amount. The missing cash was diverted directly to the Treasury, creating a continuous, uninterrupted river of capital flowing into Washington. This mechanism was officially codified in the current Tax Payment Act of 1943. By extracting the funds weekly rather than annually, the government effectively secured a massive, interest-free loan from every wage earner in America. Morgenthau had successfully normalized a level of state intervention in personal finances that would have sparked a revolution just a decade earlier. Morgenthau's system proved devastatingly effective, allowing the United States to finance the most expensive war in human history without triggering catastrophic inflation. By 1945, the federal government was extracting over $40 billion annually, a staggering increase from the mere $5 billion collected just 5 years prior. The number of individual taxpayers had exploded from roughly 4 million to over 42 million citizens. But the real triumph for the Treasury was not just the sheer volume of money collected, but the permanent change in public psychology. The pain of taxation was atomized, spread out over 52 tiny weekly paper cuts rather than one massive, agonizing amputation in the spring. By hiding the true cost of government within the mundane routine of payroll processing, Morgenthau minimized political friction and ensured compliance. When the war ended, many assumed this emergency measure would be repealed and the tax burden would return to the wealthy elites. But governments rarely relinquish a reliable revenue stream once the administrative machinery is fully operational. The withholding system was simply too efficient, too quiet, and too lucrative to dismantle. The legacy of Morgenthau's quiet revolution is the modern reality of the American paycheck. Today, we inherently accept that a portion of our labor belongs to the state before we even have the legal right to touch the compensation. The system relies entirely on the psychological distance created by that W-4 form, shielding us from the true scale of our annual contribution. This mechanism fundamentally altered the power dynamic between the citizen and the state, transforming taxation from a conscious civic duty into a passive, unavoidable condition of employment. The government no longer has to ask for your money or trust you to save it. They simply take it before you have the chance to spend it. Does this automatic extraction represent a necessary efficiency for a modern society, or a dangerous overreach that shields government spending from direct taxpayer scrutiny? Consider that tension the next time you glance at the deduction column on your pay stub. We live our lives navigating systems designed decades ago by people whose names we rarely know. solving crises that ended long before we were born. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden history of the financial architecture that controls your daily life, subscribe to our channel. Next time, we will investigate how the modern credit card transformed consumer debt from a quiet shame into a national pastime.